Good afternoon. We're so happy to welcome you today. My name is Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly. I want to welcome you to what we consider to be a groundbreaking webinar called Nonprofit Leadership Transition and Organizational Sustainability, an updated approach that changes the landscape. We're very proud to present this webinar because it includes two of the most well-known presenters on the topics of sustainable organizational health and nonprofit leadership and executive transitions. I'll talk to you for a moment about those two presenters. But what I do want to say is this: that we've got really two almost separate topics here, but they're very intertwined. But they need to be considered by you to some extent separately. One is going to be addressed by Tom Adams, who is going to be just talking with us about organizational sustainability and executive transition, and the other will be discussed by Jeanne Bell. And that really is a deeper dive into the idea of what constitutes leadership in a sustainable organization. How do you develop it? What are the things that you can do that may not be in your mind at this point? I do want to say that this particular webinar is unusual in that we have 4 original papers which will be sent to you after the broadcast to remind you of some of the concepts surfaced here and to try to seed additional conversation on this important issue. I want to take just a very quick moment to thank our sponsor, Greater Giving. If it wasn't for our sponsors, you would not be able to attend these webinars free of charge. But they do allow us to present these in a way that will help people even with very small budgets to access the information. Greater Giving wants you to know that during periods of transition, it's very important to have stable systems that really provide access to the history and data that's important to the organization. And they provide fundraising software and resources to nonprofits and schools across the nation, helping to simplify fundraising administration and create the best donor experience possible. We hope we'll go to their website after this session. It's greatergiving.com to think about how stabilizing your fundraising systems and really making them robust actually can help in not only during transition periods, but at all times. There's no question. This webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of you, so you don't have to ask us, are we going to share the recording? We will definitely share the recording with you. And not only the recording, but again, also the papers. We're also going to make this recording available on our website along with the PowerPoint slides, and that should be important because you may know other organizations that would need access to this information, and this allows you to kind of refer them quickly to us. So I want to introduce, we will take questions. We want to leave about 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end of this webinar. And so please feel free. On the right-hand side of your screen is an area for questions. You can log into that and write questions at any time. I will keep an eye on them. If there needs to be a clarification made in the moment, I'll ask the question of the presenter. Otherwise, I'm going to hold those questions until the end and then ask them of the presenters according to what they've already covered. So I want to introduce our two presenters. The first is Tom Adams, who's the Director of Sustainability, Succession, and Transition Planning at Raffa PC. You may know his name. He's written and done a lot in the area of executive transitions for nonprofits. He's kind of a historic figure in that area. Jeanne Bell is the director of the Chief Executive Officer at CompassPoint, which, as many of you may know, is one of the premier capacity building programs in the country, if not the premier capacity building program. Jeanne herself is an expert in many areas, which include financial management of nonprofits, but also leadership and coaching and other related topics. So finally, I want to say we are on social media. You can follow today's conversation with our hashtag #LeadTheChange. And then again, feel free to post your questions whenever you are ready. So Jeanne, with that, I want to hand this presentation over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. We appreciate, Tom and I appreciate the interest in this topic, and of course we appreciate the Quarterly for its very consistent support of those of us working in the sector and also trying to support it and fund it. So thank you to the whole Nonprofit Quarterly team for your support to make this happen today. And I also on behalf of Tom want to thank both the Packard Foundations and the Annie E. Casey Foundations for they do so much in the leadership space, but in particular this kind of investment that allowed us not to do direct service, but to really reflect on practice and do field building together. So that's that really invaluable R&D money that made this reflection period possible. So let me briefly say what's happening. Ruth alluded to this, but what Tom and I are trying to do here in this project and with these aligned papers and this conversation webinar, we're trying to more effectively and more consciously link two narratives, and they are linked a little bit in the field, but I don't think we think they're linked enough. And those two narratives are the evolution of how we support organizations preparing for and going through transition, which Tom's going to talk about, 20, 25 years now into that practice. Where are we? How is it evolving? What does it require to do well by practitioners and also outgoing leaders and boards? And then this conversation that we've been in as a field in earnest now for probably 15 years about the evolution of leadership itself. How can there not be a link between supporting organizations and preparing for leadership transition and helping organizations think about who should lead and how they should lead? And so I think it's our opinion that those two conversations, while they sometimes touch amongst practitioners, have been fairly separate conversations, and that part of the opportunity here is to say, let's catch up with where we are in the practice of executive transition, and then let's also link that to where are we in our assumptions and aspirations about sector leadership generally. So that's the purpose of this, and if we can advance to the next slide. We'd like to start with just each of us speaking briefly, jumping off that sort of general purpose of why now for Raffa. This is, as I mentioned, this has been a project of reflection, learning, conversation, re-looking at data, talking to practitioners, interviewing people, doing things differently. So why, from both of our perspectives, was this a moment in time that we should be doing that? So Tom, just a few things on why this is an important moment in time for Raffa.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Ruth, for the kind of introductions. Even though you referred to me as a historic figure, I am able to talk and walk still, so I'm happy to be with everybody. The why for Raffa in this conversation started out a little bit out of frustration. Jeanne and I were on panels over the last 3 or 4 years at different places, the Alliance for Nonprofit Management and others, and we were saying different things in some ways, and I was trying to understand where our differences were coming from. And so it was trying to understand our differences that got us talking. And what we realized that what felt at first like an either-or conversation was really a both-and conversation. That it wasn't that we needed to throw executive transition out and start over with something new, but we needed to re-look at executive transition with a broader lens and to figure out how to use both the powerful time of executive transition and the preparation for it to change the paradigm around leadership and who leads and how leadership and power are shared in organizations. And that's really what we're up to today. The other piece of why now for Raffa is that when we began to look at this, it was exciting to see, and I was wondering why, well, funders aren't talking about transitions as much as they used to, and they're not, there's not as, it used to be 20, 25 years ago, if you went to a coffee shop or a cocktail party everybody had a transition horror story for you. Transitions were difficult, they were crises, and there were no tools, no way to really address them. We have those tools and those capabilities now, so there's not the drama and trauma in executive transition if you choose to. You can obviously continue to make it difficult if you ignore what's been learned. But if you pay attention to what's been learned, you can get reasonably good outcomes. But as Jeanne will point out in her data, that hasn't changed necessarily the sector in the ways we'd like to see it change. And so we're going to really be talking about how to move from executive transition to organizational transition, how to link organizational and leadership transition. And the W.K. Kellogg Foundation invested $930,000 to start this work in the 90s. A number of national organizations, NeighborWorks America, Girl Scouts of America, United Way, the WISE, all saw transition as something they needed to invest in. And so we have a lot of learning and collective wisdom from the Daring to Lead studies. And so we can really build on that equity and then add to it what we've learned coming out of the recession. The recession was a big wake up for all of us, and it's really changed how most organizations do business. And so we want to talk a little bit today about what the wider lens is around these evolving trends and these allied services, and then how to connect it with really larger systemic change. Jeanne?
Great, yeah, and just to build on that, for CompassPoint, we too have been doing executive transition management practice for at least almost 20 years, and it was a part of our practice. Over the last 10 years, as I mentioned earlier, the role of leadership development and our conception of leadership development grew so much that we sort of evolved as an organization from a consulting and training organization much more to a leadership development organization. And I know from talking to many of you that your organizations have been on similar paths. And so we were coming up against, we have this executive transition management consulting practice, and then we have all of this work in leadership development, and we haven't found a way to connect those two things because we're talking about leadership in this way in this space, and then here we're trying to support boards in a time of transition, but it's difficult to bring those two conversations together, and we were wanting to do that. So again, we thank our supporters for allowing us to do that, and it was a time to stop and look at, we did 3 Daring to Lead reports that some of you are aware of in 2001, 2006, 2011, and then we did another piece with Jan Masaoka and Blue Avocado a couple of years ago, just collecting data from about 850 executives about their experience of transition. So we have this sort of data. It's not longitudinal, but they're very similarly collected sized data sets from community-based organizations nationally, and some of the data is so stagnant in so many ways that it just caused us, it was time to stop and reflect. So again, that's where we are, and we're excited to link these two conversations because I think Tom and I, after being in conversation about this over the last couple of years, arrived at this conclusion that's in front of you on the slide. As leaders, as boards, as practitioners, as funders, we need to both affirm and broaden our approach to the critical support organizations preparing for ET need, but we also at the same time need to challenge the sector on who leads and how. And so I do think it's one conversation, but it's a big, complicated conversation. So if you could advance the slide, Tom's going to catch us up on where we are in the practice of ETM and some facts about that.
Yep. So I'll be brief. I think most of you are familiar with this. Transitions prior the work that Kellogg and Casey and others funded, board's reaction to an executive transition was one of panic. Who do I call? Who do I know? Let's get this job filled as quickly as we can. The 3-phase process that came out of the Kellogg and the Casey research and others talks about really stepping back and understanding the context of transition. That if we don't understand the context, then we're really not making the most of this opportunity. And transitions are opportunities to advance organizations' capacity to deliver on mission. And so the prepare phase is critical to being able to take that deeper look. We're going to talk later about the need for an earlier prepare phase that goes back even further, but this is in the couple months before you begin your search for an executive. The search and how to make that something that's proactive and is really creating a diverse and inclusive pool that reflects the communities you serve, something we know how to do now. And then onboarding of the new executive. which is really a critical and work that the Meyer Foundation and Jeanne and Rick Moyers did a couple of years ago, pointed out that there's a little honeymoon when the new executive comes on for the first few months. It's really in year 1 to 3 where the executive decides whether they're going to stay or not. You know, they're either supported and they're making progress or they're not, and that leads to turnover and churn and mission, lack of mission follow through when we have those turnovers. So this process works. It gets organizations to a good place with a new executive in place. If we go to the next slide, please. In developing this and doing this practice for the last 20 years in research, 8 to 10% of organizations transition executives every year. That's good news and bad news. I mean, really, if we were influencing in a positive way 8 to 10% of organizations every year, over 5 years we would have changed half the sector. And unfortunately, it's not that simple, obviously, but there is a great opportunity there that we need to figure out how to take better attention to. I mentioned already the investment that's been made, and we really do know how to reduce the risks of transitions and to handle different kinds. We did a retrospective look at 30 transitions done by 4Acre in Alaska, CompassPoint in the Bay Area, and transition guides in the greater Washington area nationally, and found that where organizations really use this process, whether it was a turnaround, whether they were sustaining success, whether it was a founder, it worked in all kinds of different situations and environments. So you know, when applied, it does work. I think a lot of boards still have a struggle with the difference between executive transition and executive search. That there's that the focus is on the hero leader, who's going to be our next leader, rather than what's this transition opportunity mean for this organization, and how do we make the most of it. And we need to really work a lot harder in making that distinction clear. There's a real big distinction between transition and search. As I mentioned earlier, the recession really made the issue of organizational sustainability central and made it clear how deeply context. If you look at food banks, if you look at organizations serving individuals with developmental disabilities, if you look at community development, any sector you look at capacity building itself, we've all been impacted by changes in the economic structure of this country and in how money flows to nonprofits. And finally, there's a real opportunity to change the culture of nonprofits. Unfortunately, our passion says that all we got to do is find good people and keep plowing ahead. And what that results in is burning up good people. And so we need to take a deeper look at the culture that really supports our institutions. Next slide, Jeanne.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to share at this moment some of the data that was from that last data collection with Blue Avocado. This was 885 executives talking about their experience of coming into the organization. So these were the incoming executives, some very recent, some not, but just reflecting on their experience of coming into an organization. All of this data is online at compasspoint.org/revisiting-ET. And that slide will be at the end. You'll see Tom's materials and et cetera. But just to give you a taste of it, only 20% of those organizations, again, 885 community-based organizations nationally, only 20% got the kind of support Tom just described. So while we have deep knowledge of how to do it, there's still many, many, many organizations who are self-facilitating this and not getting that support that was just described, which is probably part of why you see data like this, that 27%, only 27% of the executives describe their experience coming into the organization as fairly smooth or smooth. The majority said it was fairly rocky or very rocky. And of particular interest to me, now this was coming off the recession, but this also matches data I've had sort of anecdotally looking during this reflection period. The vast majority of executives describe their experience as walking into financial crisis or weakness. So again, imagine doing that probably a little bit blind and without adequate support. It's really problematic, and it leads to the kind of challenges Tom talked about in terms of retention and personal sustainability for executives. So there's more data like this, but we do know that without support, and even with support in really challenging times, it is very difficult to step into executive leadership And what we'll see later is primarily people are doing that from outside the organization. So they're relying on that board recruitment process and whatever support the consultant is offering, if any, to make sense of this place and step into leadership. It's very, very challenging. So I know that that has led in the ETM field to a broad discussion about what kind of allied practices have been included in the notion of ETM more broadly. So I'm going to give it back to you, Tom, to advance the slide and talk about that.
Great. So I think we went the wrong way. There we go. So as I mentioned, the recession was a wake-up call. Prior to the recession, succession planning was beginning to get roots in the nonprofit sector. Boards and funders were saying, yeah, it makes sense to think about leadership continuity and to take it out of, it's a loaded word. Executives are afraid that what it's really going to translate into somebody telling me it's time to go before I really want to go. And so they're reluctant to bring it up. And boards don't want to offend their executive. They're afraid they're going to send the wrong signal to the executive. And so the language of how we talk about and make normalized discussions about succession is really an important part of the culture change for our sector. To be able to say every leader will leave, every organization can't depend on one or two people, that we really need to build a community and build an organization that's strong with depth. And to do that, we really need to pay attention to leader development. And we were making progress. And you'll recall in the mid-2000s, funders were doing next generation leadership programs, and there was a lot of talk about leader development. The recession came, and we focused on survival, human survival for people in need, and organizational survival. And that led to a whole much broader discussion about what is sustainability. And Jeanne and Jan Masaoka and others led the discussion about that, of connecting mission and financial impact. 4-Acre and Transition Guides also advanced it, and to look at, it's really a deeper kind of strategic planning. How do we look at the intersection of leadership, both board and staff, strategy and business model, culture, and resources? How do those things, and that's the context of organizational transition. And if we only pay attention to sustainability at transition time, then we're making it hard on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so our hope in this conversation is that we can normalize attention to succession and sustainability, that it's part of every organization's discussion every year, and that it becomes an ongoing concern. That is going to change the way we do business. Without that pivot, we're still into reactive mode and moving from one hero leader to the other. Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail. And so we have 20 or 30% of our organizations that are high achievers at any given time. And it'll be a different 20 or 30% in 5 years, but it'll still only be 20 or 30%. And the goal of this discussion is to get it to 50 and 60 and 70% of high performers, because that's going to make a difference in America and make a difference in the world, in the communities we're serving. And so it's how to integrate this, to step back from executive transition, look at it more broadly. This is true in all organizations. It's desperately true in organizations led by founders and long-term executives. If a board has had the same executive for 20 or 30 years, there has to be a comfort of how they're doing business with each other. And so they can't expect the next executive to walk in, sit in that chair, and relate to them in the same way, and yet boards do. And so for founder and long-term executives, the sustainability and succession preparation 3 to 5 years in advance is really best practice now. Next slide.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And just to underscore what you just said, you're positing that 3 to 5 years in advance, there's open discussion about succession planning. And again, the last Daring to Lead in 2011 found that while we are having a conversation about succession planning, it's not happening near to the scale. And some of those same dynamics about, does that make me a lame duck? Will funders find out? Will staff respond the same way? We're still struggling with normalizing it. So, trying to maybe be used by braiding these conversations. I'm hoping that that will contribute to the normalization. I think that part of the reason it doesn't take root is because it's only in the context of executive transition, which still sounds like I'm leaving, right? And so if we can broaden this, even though it makes the canvas very large and a bit complex, as the three of us were talking about before the webinar comes on, they are in fact related. If I'm not doing leadership development more broadly in my organization, then it is scary to talk about executive transition because nobody knows what that means. No one can picture it. But if we are surrounded by leaders, then whether or not one of them does in fact become the next ED, at least we feel that we are in a space of shared leadership and we don't have this sense of, oh my God, how will we hand this baton and who will that be and where will they come from, right? I think those are natural resistance factors to the kind of work that is clearly needed and that you're advocating. So coming off of this, trying to braid this conversation, I think one way to do it is to say, and some of this, part of this is more sort of from our perspective at CompassPoint, and I think we have alignment around it conceptually, but it's trying to bring these two pieces together, that there's no doubt, based on very consistent data, at least over the 15 years we've all been looking at it, that we still aren't doing a good enough job of broadly engaging in ETM practices, and especially these more broadly defined practices that include succession and sustainability thinking and planning, really on an ongoing basis, and then for long-time leaders preparing to leave, really earlier conversation about succession. So there's a strengthening organizations piece that still needs attention. And I think there's also a transforming sector leadership conversation that's been going on, but these have not been linked. So if we're talking about transforming sector leadership, but we don't change the way we think about executive transition, well, how is that going to happen? Because we're talking about, you know, having more people of color in leadership, transforming organizations, disrupting the status quo, and then if boards aren't there and because they haven't been supported to be there, when they get to an executive transition, how likely are they in that moment, even with the best support, to actually reimagine leadership? That's an unrealistic expectation, right? So we have to open the conversation to also include, I think, transforming sector leadership, which would include these second points in the middle here, promoting and developing and supporting more leaders of color, and whether folks are people of color or white folks, being really clear that we need leaders, certainly in social change organizations, with an explicit equity analysis that are coming into this not just with management strength, but actually wanting to transform the sector, create, accelerate social change. And so that takes a certain kind of leadership development to make sure those folks are supported and recognized and getting opportunities once these transitions come up. And then I think the third piece, which we also have been talking about, but not linking to moments of transition, is we need to change the way we lead. And a lot of the leadership programs around the country have been talking about this for a long time: personal sustainability, shared leadership, equity, all these things. Well, we need to actually start restructuring organizations, reimagining compensation, you know, doing things that are going to transform how leadership is done, by whom and how. And it seems to me that if we're looking at 10 or 12% of organizations transitioning every year, if we aren't doing those in parallel, we're just going to keep perpetuating this thing where we need a hero to come in and save this organization, as opposed to we've built a leadership culture that will actually transition smoothly. So that's the idea here. And I think, I want to reiterate what Ruth said, that this has very serious implications for executives, current executives. Am I doing the work with my board and with our staff to really do numbers 2 and 3 here, or the middle and bottom part of the middle here? Am I helping to get this organization ready for new leadership, and not just new leadership of a new person, but the next kind of leadership we need? And it also has a lot of implications for practitioners. I know Tom has been leading lots of conversations around the country, trying to bring people together to expand what the practice of ETM looks like. And obviously it has implications for funders, who are very often the ones who are paying for and supporting strategic grantees during these transitions. Next slide, please. So a couple more data points that now looking, again, these are not the same data sets, but similarly collected and sized kinds of inquiries, grounded research that CompassPoint has done sort of every 5 years. Just to give you an example, the data doesn't move at all. In fact, in these two, it kind of went down. It doesn't matter. It basically has been the same the whole time. Every time we go out with an executive survey, we get back essentially 75% white leaders, and that was true in 2001, and it's true in 2015. So again, a lot, but over that time, a lot of discourse has changed about who should lead, but we're still getting the same data back. Next slide. Lost my slide here. And then I think the one that is a sort of personal passion, I think, of ours at CompassPoint, and the thing where I really think there's a major disconnect in the discourse that we have to take responsibility for. Really, I would say more. We're not doing a good enough job. Leadership development has become not only we've been talking about it, ad nauseum for 15 years now, but it has also become a core programmatic strategy of many, many organizations. We talk about leadership development in the context of civic engagement, of social change, of community change. Theoretically, nonprofits should be the premier leadership development people, right? Whether it's youth development, et cetera. Almost every client I have now has a leadership development component to what they do, right? And of course, those of us in the capacity building field, as I said, have shifted most of our real estate to more intensive sort of cohort work, coaching, leadership development. And yet, we cannot seem to develop our future executives. And so, again, that data didn't move at all, which I actually did find surprising between 2001 and 2015, that we're still only just under 1 in 3 nonprofits is able to source its own future leadership. I was talking to Mark Leach at MAG the other day, and he said when he does executive transition now, he doesn't ask the question, who's your next executive? He says, who and what is your next executive leadership? Okay, so part of the reason this isn't moving is because we have not changed the definition of who leads and how, and we're not preparing for a different kind of leadership. So if we're looking for to replace that exact person, well, that exact person and the way they've been leading, of course it doesn't exist in the organization because they've been leading that way. You have to, if you're looking for that, you're going to go outside every time. And I know, I'm sure we're going to get comments here, and I welcome the debate. People are going to say nonprofits are too small to develop their own leadership, and I just really disagree with that. In fact, current management thinking is that in some ways, the smaller you are, the easier it is to break down traditional job descriptions, treat people as adults, define roles that really work based on people's strengths. I would argue it's actually harder in a large hierarchical organization to create the spaces for people to move beyond their jobs. So we need to think much less traditionally about who can lead from wherever they're sitting in the organization. And I think we have to take it as a mandate as a sector, not to be talking about leadership development externally and not find our own capability to do it internally. And so I'd like to share this final slide. If you switch to the next thing, part of what we did in this reflection process was we noticed, well, look at that. 3 of the sort of progressive leadership development organizations most respected in the country all now have co-executives. And that happened over the course of the last, 3 or 4 years for all of them. And that's not a coincidence, right? That these are folks who are trying to push leadership in a different direction, help us redefine leadership. And, independently, they had all come to the decision that they should at least be sharing power and in the executive leadership role. And so we did a focus group with them and a couple of other groups who are not leadership development organizations. But I just wanted to share a couple quotes. And this also is on the website, the write-up of this focus group, which I just, I like to reread. I find it so thrilling and kind of liberating to think differently about what executive leadership is. So the first one is from Darlene Nipper, who's a co-leader at Rockwood Leadership Institute, who I'm sure everyone on the call probably has heard of. And they're a leadership development organization that has moved to a co-leader model. She calls it partner leadership, actually. And her point was, a quote from her is, "We're different people from the folks who have informed the thinking about organizational leadership and management over the last 100 years. We come at it differently, right? There are different ways to conceive of this." And it's actually been being conceived of very differently in communities of color and non-traditional settings, obviously, for a long time. I think the opportunity here is to say, what can we learn, if you will, quote unquote, from the margins and bring that to the center, which is more sustainable, more collaborative, more equitable leadership practices. The second quote is from, I'm sorry, my text is so small, from Alyssa at MAG, and she said, "We were really, really clear at MAG that MAG needed to shift its internal practice and behavior and culture to reflect the world we are contributing to making." So this is another point I think that we hear a lot, and it's the opportunity is to take what we're saying we want the world to be and actually try to create it inside our organizations. And so what they were doing as they evolved their work to be more relevant to this moment is saying we can't be this traditional hierarchy and then go out in the world and try to support progressive network development. There's a dissonance there that's untenable, right? And the third quote is from Francis Kuhnreuter at Building Movement Project, and this is about personal sustainability and isolation, that we all agreed in this focus group that it's not actually less time. They just get more done, so it's not less time, but it feels different. So her point was it's not fewer hours to share executive leadership, but it's less pressure and less isolation. She said, I can't even say how different it is. It's dramatically different, which is a big sustainability issue for me. And you could really feel that in this focus group, the sense that I'm not carrying this alone, right? So this gets to the how we lead. If we don't start to change how we lead, the people that we want, the people with the critical analysis, the people that want to disrupt the status quo, they're not going to take these traditional jobs. Why would they? They're not in settings that reflect how we want the world to be, right? So it's who leads, but also can we, those of us in power now, create this, we can imagine these roles so they would even want to step into them and then take it to the next place where they're going to take it. Okay, so I'm just going to bring up again that at the next slide is a reiteration of this intersection that Tom and I are arguing for, which is to really engage more consciously and intentionally in these extended ETM practices, normalize succession, link it to sustainability, et cetera, but at the same time be mindful of our responsibility to transform sector leadership too, which is, again, more people of color, more people with a critical analysis, and more space to reimagine leadership itself inside organizations. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Ruth, to ask questions or moderate what you're seeing in the chat box.
Perfect. Okay.
I wouldn't go that far on the slides, if you don't mind. If we can go back to the one more slide back, just to see if we can kind of hold the. We're trying to talk about a lot at once here, so I want to just help the participants engage with these related ideas.
Okay, and I wanna encourage people still. You can log your questions into the question area in case you want to. We have a lot already, but I want to make sure that we surface most of what's going on in your mind about what you've just heard. This is, I think, the reason why I called this groundbreaking. I think it's really quite of an inflection point in the practice. I think at the same time, many people have been talking about trying to develop more leaderful organizations, organizations that are full of people who know the important variables about how the organization works, who have the contacts, who have the, the fundraising skills and the relationships with constituents, all of that. That the more that's shared out, the more robust is the capacity of that organization, and so it has implications for everything from hiring to to how you view decision making and all of that. So it's not a small order what you're talking about. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that this, in fact, creates a situation in which you should pretty much avoid emergency transitions unless actually somebody kind of drops on the street. That, you're probably going to have some discernment applied to situations that begin to get thorny inside of organizations on a more regular basis. There will be more constant struggling with the critical issues of the organization earlier than there would be in an organization where you have more of a triangular structure. And so this becomes more than a conversation about executive transition, so that's certainly one way into it. One of the questions that I got is, a couple of questions asked for some stories that exhibit kind of almost a before and after picture of what an organization might get with a less shared leadership structure and a more shared leadership structure at the moment of transition, and even before that. So can I call on you first, Jeanne?
Yeah, and let me just make sure, are you saying that if shared leadership is at least, being attempted, I hope I haven't in any way romanticized its ease, it's not easy at all, right? But if it's at least kind of getting rooted or is in place, how would the executive transition be different?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to
You're
point
not talking about shared leadership as a larger scheme, not just at the executive level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things we heard in the focus group, and if you look at it, you'll see the write-up, is that co-executive leadership is really only a sign, as you're saying, of a broader thing going on. I mean, once you open that role up, you really, it forces you to re-examine a whole set of things, because in fact, having one person at the top maintains a set of assumptions and that run through a whole system, right? That the next layer is the next most qualified, and the next layer is the next most qualified. And all these assumptions get reinforced by that pyramid. So it's more than just, again, as you're saying, those two people. If it's two people sharing the executive leadership, but once you do that, it opens up all these assumptions. And to me, that's one of the powerful things. Well, if they can share leadership, who else is sharing leadership, or how are we sharing leadership at other places, right? So I want to make sure that I'm not suggesting that if shared leadership exists in an organization, you'll always be able to find somebody from within. It's not only about filling the executive role. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, all those things you just said. It's about the kind of collective work we want to do as progressive people, right? The actual systems inside our nonprofits right now, I think, are mirroring corporate things. They really are, and so we're living in this dissonance of, I want to accelerate social change, but I need to do this very arcane performance management system that treats you like, a cog in a wheel. That's many nonprofits are still suffering from that, and we serve a lot of progressive organizations that are really struggling with it because they're taking this fire hose of information that best practice requires all of these traditional management things, and they're trying to do transformational work, right? It doesn't work. So we do need to start at home, right? We need to start at home, and again, many organizations are already that way. But Tom and I serve, sort of a lot of that middle ground of groups that know they have to reinvent things, and they can't do it without starting with reinventing themselves. The dissonance just gets too big, right? The gap too wide between what we aspire to and how we're structuring and behaving inside our systems.
Right.
I think that also, Ruth, if you think about the continuum, shared leadership, particularly if you're sharing top leadership at a certain point, and then how do you get there? And so the other data point about internal succession, the case study that we're sending out with this mailing points to an organization that thought it needed a new hero leader. Their world was changing. The executive had been there 10 years, but the board was beginning to lack confidence because they weren't sure he could lead them through the change. And by stepping back and looking at sustainability and looking at their bench and seeing how strong the middle managers were in that organization, and particularly how strong the chief operating officer was, and that really the chief operating officer was more of a strategic thinker than the executive, and that internal promotion really made a lot of sense. They didn't start out there. They started out thinking that, well, if the person who doesn't have vision hired the COO, then she doesn't have vision either, and we need to go outside. They did some internal planning and had the COO lead a line of business review and saw that the talent they had around at the middle management level and began to engage the whole system, and that led to what I'd call more shared leadership and to internal succession.
Ruth, real quick, Ruth. I mean, we don't have time to. This is a whole other conversation, but one of the systemic drags on this progress is that boards don't have the support and the structures to even understand the bench strength. We have habits and I certainly embody this. We have habits of the ED is sandwiched between these two distinct groups. And she is seeing, or he is seeing, their strengths, but none of them can see each other's strengths. And that leads on both sides to the board viewing itself alone as the client sometimes of an executive transition, right? And feeling it has to just figure this out and go find this person. And of course, it leads to staff not understanding or trusting perhaps that those people are going to look to them for their guidance and advice and vice versa. So again, we've been saying this for 20 years. What are we going to do about it?
Right, and it's excruciating to talk about because we have, in fact, been hearing the same thing for 20, 30 years, that there's something wrong in the basic framing of this issue, and we're not dealing up front with it. I want to go to another question. I want to say before I do that as Jeanne knows, because she is on our board, NPQ is a dual leadership organization. And shared leadership organization. But that was not necessarily an assumption that other people wanted to accept. When we proposed that dual leadership situation, especially since I'm a founder, some people just, their immediate reaction was, that's not going to work. You know, Ruth is too headstrong. They had a million reasons why it wasn't going to work. And in fact, the relationship has progressed along, I think, extremely well. But some of this is really about external pushback, and the pushback of people who have not experienced how you handle that shared leadership and what it really means about accountability and what it means about the time and the sharing of work. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because people are asking questions about how do we begin to try to educate our boards about this, never mind our funders. In some of the questions, and I've gotten this question a lot, how do we begin to talk to our boards about this? We think they would be allergic on site. Is, you know, how do you begin to re-educate a little bit? What steps do you take first, second, and third?
Well, I'll just say one, and I'll hand it to you, Tom. I mean, I think, and please, I know that I'm saying this from a place of, you know, regret at not having done it better and faster. So, you know, we're all in this together. But I think, you know, as just kind of a student of what seems to be happening, I think the first thing is, if we're really going to treat these organizations, and I know that this is not every nonprofit, so I'm not speaking from a place of neutrality. I'm speaking to folks who really want to see change, you know, not just organizational health, but actual change, you know. We need to build relationships. I mean, it starts with relationships, and again, hierarchy in some ways codifies relationships as opposed to really opening and deepening them. And so most of our structures are currently designed to contain these relationships. And as you said, we've taught that as best practice, and I've certainly felt it at times. Like, this is good. Everybody knows their role, and they just stay out of each other's way. Well, part of that means that boards are going to be, unless they're extremely sensitive and proactive, they're not going to have a finger on the pulse of the aspiration of the staff, right? And it's a lot to put on a single executive to be that translator. So for me, it starts at reimagining what the relationships are across the system, both across the staff, but across staff and board, and even more broadly to funders and community. In the focus group we had, those co-directors heard exactly what you said, Ruth. The outside world is the one they struggle with. Funders want to talk, well, who's in charge? But, you know, to the one person who has decision-making authority, you know, who's accountable. Those are deeply entrenched beliefs, not just in the nonprofit sector, everywhere. Mm-hmm. What would you say, Tom?
So I think, first of all, we have the problem we always have, that the sector is very wide and diverse. And so the culture is part of sustainability, because we've got to understand what's going on. The Kellogg Foundation some years ago did a study of what motivated nonprofit leaders. A third were motivated by a desire for social change, a third by their faiths, and a third by a desire to serve. I think that's a helpful paradigm for us.
That is.
When we think about what does shared leadership look like in different cultures and different types of organizations, and how to adapt our language so it's not off-putting. You know, you're either, and again, it's not either or, in or out, but what does it look like in our environment to do the work we're trying to do? And I think the challenge is that because the board leaders change, and all it takes is one or two corporate type board leaders who have kind of a hierarchical kind of top-down approach to life. And so to get it into the roots of an organization, it really has to be board, executive, management, staff alignment. And that's a tall order. And so I think I was thinking about your slides and how do we really get real change? Well, there are a certain percentage of organizations that are financially healthy and relatively well run right now. And if we started with those across those three domains and just said, okay, how do we do a better job in those transitions? Because they're not setting people of color up to lead a failed organization. They're taking something that's working right now, say, okay, let's broaden the pool of talent, and let's talk about what would shared leadership and recalibrating the boards and the executives, to really do a whole set of pilots across a range of organizations that really take into account the culture and how we adapt these ideas into different cultures.
Thank you. That data is important. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah. Somebody is asking, again, this might be a little reiterative, but not really. Can you talk about some potential strategies to nudge the local philanthropic sector outside of their hidebound thinking about ET towards a more enlightened approach? And again, this is where we got a little bit of pushback when we made our change, was from our philanthropic partners who were doubtful, very doubtful. Internally, I think we were all on the same page. I think you would agree, Jeanne, right? That was what we wanted. And so how do you begin to talk with the local philanthropic sector? Who should be talking with them? How should you be talking with them?
I think if I could just, a lot of the education around the current thinking came out of the work that Casey funded and others from 2000 to 2005. At every GEO conference, there was a discussion about this. At the Grant Makers in Health, there was a discussion. At the Council of Foundations, at the Community Foundation, there was capital invested. The Casey Foundation was putting up $800,000 a year in what they call field building for 5 years. That's $4 million to advance this thinking. And so for this to really change, we were talking with a funder who understands this very well, Jeanne and I, a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying how most folks, it's not even on the radar. The leadership isn't, because everything is so siloed into topics that we don't look at the whole. And so I think we need a really large-scale project that's done in small increments in different communities. It really is about discussion, conversation, and education to talk about why there's more than one way to do this, and that there's new learning that's going to help us all do our jobs better.
I have just one sentence to add. I think that another thing that's breaking down is this distinction between who we are inside and who we are outside. And that's good. That breaks down that nonprofit expert, service kind of mentality. And so I think that one way we can do this as leaders, so now I'm speaking to fellow nonprofit leaders, is if you have something like a theory of change or some concise way that you talk about your intended impact and your strategies, why not bring your approach to leadership onto that document? I mean, I think what we're saying now is that there's no different. If you're not running the system internally, how can you be running it externally, right? And again, so many of my clients that aren't leadership development organizations see leadership development as one of their core strategies externally. And so can we break down that distinction? And so when we're talking to philanthropy, what we're talking about is sort of who we are and how we are working, but that includes who we are and how we structure ourselves and what kind of investment we need to do that well. So instead of talking about leadership, as Tom's saying, as a separate conversation, help me get ready for leadership transition, see leadership as part of the efficacy conversation, the theory of change.
Right. I think this is so interesting because it really pushes us to think about a number of organizational challenges as all one piece of work. That in fact we need, if we're not fully utilizing the leadership and skills base of our of our staff, in fact, we're not doing the right thing by our organizations. And if we're so tightly bound into leadership, into kind of a strict leadership frame, a hierarchical leadership frame, we're probably not using all the skills and talents of our staff. And so, there is a piece of this that is just about larger honoring of our mission. And carrying forward of our mission that really speaks to the heart of who nonprofits are. I'm getting a lot of questions from participants that say that they would like to hear much more about how shared leadership actually works, that they in fact would like to see some leadership duos come on and act as a panel to this discussion. And I think that's a brilliant idea, because I think for people who haven't tried this at home, it still seems a little vague. And, it doesn't end at the executive and the executive suite. There's a value set that you have to organize yourself by, and you can't dishonor it at any point. So it is a commitment for organizations to do this. But as you say, Jeanne, it does speak to our larger practice in a lot of cases. I want to just move back to Tom for a minute, and Tom, just ask you to talk about, we've talked a couple of times here about this really being, a broadening of the practice of executive transitions. And can you kind of describe what that broadening is again, so that we have a sum up of it, and then I'd like to go back to Jeanne to do the same thing.
Sure. Thank you, Ruth. So there's really two broadenings, maybe three. The first is the basic idea that there's a difference between transition and search, and that you can get help. Jeanne's point that only 20% are getting help, whether you're getting it out of a book or you're getting it from a consultant, but there is help out there for you. And so we need to do a better job, period. The second broadening is looking at the context and making ongoing work attention to succession and sustainability, and taking those words that are kind of loaded and have different meanings for different people and making them relevant to different kinds and types of organizations. The conversation is different in different places and different cultures. And so we need to appreciate and really push that out. And then finally, the broadening is, how do we help boards, besides stepping back and saying, do we need to merge when they face an executive transition, to also step back and say, well, what are we saying about our values, about how we think about leadership here, and about how we do share power, and how do we advance diversity? I've been in thousands of conversations with boards about diversity and what's our goal. And I have worked on probably dozens of projects with that end. And it's a complex, difficult societal issue. But it really, if it's not part of our practice, then we're not going to make any progress on it. And so how do we really take sharing of power and having our communities reflect the diversity and not setting people up in that process? How do we get that done?
Jeanne?
Yeah, and I would just say that, those of us who currently are in positions of power and influence, whether in our organizations, at a field or sector level, at a philanthropic level, I feel like we're at this moment where if we don't start actualizing what we've been describing, and also what people have been saying to us very loudly for a long time about who should be leading with what analysis and how, and please know I put myself right in the center of that, we are going to miss an opportunity given the degree of transition we're going to see. We're going to miss a huge opportunity, and we're going to be missing our mandate. And my fear is that we'll look up another 15 years from now, and this data will still be stagnant, and that we've the other piece that's could you go to the next slide actually, since that way people can see where Tom's piece is, and this middle piece about I think as Ds we have to make sure that we're not helping or colluding with our boards thinking that the question at hand is just to make the right hire. there's a bigger responsibility than that if you care about transforming the sector. So I know it's a big mandate, but if you're on a board right now, in my opinion, certainly in any kind of a social change context, it's not a win just to get a competent next ED. It is more of a systemic question of, are we contributing to changing the way leadership is done? Are we sure that we've looked broadly at non-traditional folks? Have we done the kind of outreach we need to do, right? And then certainly if you have power at the field level or infrastructure level or philanthropic level to say, we're not going to get there hire by hire. There's a good hire, but there's something that has to change about, again, who we assume can lead, how they're supported to lead, how we're willing to change the systems that have supported us so that they can support them, right? I mean, so it's big systemic change work, but each hire is contributing to that system, so we got to be able to work at the micro and the macro. So that's what I would say. That's what I mean by these intersecting fronts. To me right now, in this moment in time, every hire matters. Are we contributing to the change, right? Or are we saying, oh well, we did the best we could here, but I hope someday that data changes.